Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the Center for Promise and the GradNation campaign housed by America's Promise Alliance. We're thrilled that you're all here. Welcome to our webinar, releasing our new report, Disciplined and Disconnected, the Experience of Exclusionary Discipline and the Promise of Non-Exclusionary Alternatives. Before we begin, we want to note a few ground rules. Due to the volume of participants today, everyone has been muted. At any time during the presentation, you can use the questions panel to write and submit your questions. We will try to take as many questions as possible following the presentation. We invite you to join the conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag GradNation during and after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded. A link will be shared in the coming days on the GradNation website. Finally, we encourage all participants to take a 2 to 3 minute survey immediately following today's webinar. This survey information will help us better understand who you are, whether this webinar was valuable to you and your work, and what topics you potentially like to see covered in the future. We will now get started, and the recording will begin. We're thrilled that you're all here to join us. First, I want to give you an overview of today's agenda. We'll begin by introducing GradNation and the State Activation Partnership with Pearson. Then, we'll invite Alyssa Rafa from the Education Commission of the States to discuss how states across the nation are focusing on discipline policies. Following that, we'll dive deeply into the report itself with Elizabeth Pufall-Jones sharing the findings. We'll then head into a moderated panel discussion featuring our speakers as well as an administrator and a young person from Minnesota who can talk about their experiences with discipline practices. There will be a brief question and answer period following that panel, and then we'll close. Please remember to submit your questions in the questions box throughout the course of today's discussion. We will collect questions throughout the presentation and ask them once the panel has concluded. GradNation is a national campaign to increase the high school graduation rate by 2020 and to put millions more young people on the path to adult success, a goal set over a decade ago by America's Promise Alliance, Everyone Graduates Center, Civic Enterprise, and the Alliance for Excellent Education. The GradNation campaign is focused on helping all young people earn high school diplomas, but especially those students who are most at risk of leaving school and being blocked from future opportunities for success. GradNation supports several initiatives and seeks to make systems change at the national, state, and local levels. Over the past 3 years, GradNation and Pearson have supported the State Activation Initiative. The theory of change behind the State Activation Initiative is that national partners like America's Promise Alliance and Pearson can collaborate with state-level organizations like the Minnesota Alliance with Youth to build support and implement change in order to accelerate progress to a 90% high school graduation rate. America's Promise, supported by Pearson, has been working with the Minnesota Alliance with Youth for 3 years on this initiative. Even since the beginning of the partnership, the team here has understood the impact that exclusionary discipline policies can have on students. Part of the State Activation Initiative partnership included a dedicated research opportunity, so it naturally made sense to study discipline and its effects for the young people in Minnesota. I think this research sheds light on what it's like for young people to experience exclusionary discipline, and it will play an important part in the conversation about discipline policies moving forward. Pearson has been an invaluable partner to America's Promise in implementing the State Activation Initiative. State activation was born out of the idea that state-level stakeholders can act in powerful ways to increase high school graduation rates. I know that Minnesota was considered a strong addition to the State Activation Initiative because of the Minnesota Alliance with Youth's 7 priority recommendations, which, when implemented comprehensively, would lead to increased high school graduation rates. The partnership between America's Promise, Pearson, and the Minnesota Alliance with Youth has highlighted the importance of listening to young people and developing solutions based on their needs. We'd like to introduce Stacy Skelly, the Vice President of Corporate Affairs at Pearson, who can speak more about Pearson's relationship with the State Activation Initiative. Put her video on.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. Well, so happy to be here with you today. Thank you. And thank you for allowing me to talk with you very briefly What Liz just laid out was an excellent example of the work that's been happening with our individual state grantees. As she noted, I am in charge of strategic communications at Pearson, focused on our North America businesses and our assessment work, all in pursuit of helping students, parents, teachers all do their best. I'm excited to be here in support of our collective mission together and our longstanding commitment to both America's Promise, but also our 3 state grantees, specifically today our Minnesota Alliance with Youth colleagues. This latest research from Minnesota is a great example of what can be done when national organizations come together with local organizations and the individuals impacted by our practices. 3 years ago, the GradNation state activation campaign kicked off in support of increasing our graduation rates and seeing students flourish. The 3 key themes that we've been working toward in these 3 years are statewide innovation and collaboration, our shared knowledge about what works, best practices, which you'll see here today a little bit, and our successful models, what's out there that's working and how can that be shared. Today, the webinar is going to focus on Minnesota, the voices of the youth in that state, and understanding what exclusionary discipline practices and the negative impact they might have on youth themselves. I'm hopeful that we can inspire some thinking for state innovation, district innovation, individual schools, our communities to all come together in support of our students getting a successful graduation under the belt and onto a college or career path that makes sense for them. The voices of youth are so important to the work that we do, and I'm proud to support the Center for Promise, America's Promise, and Minnesota Alliance with Youth in their efforts. Thank you. I hope we have a great discussion today and look forward to sharing the research with you.
Thank you so much, Stacy. I'm really happy now to introduce Alyssa Rafa, who's a policy analyst at the Education Commission of the state. She's going to provide an overview of what states are doing in their legislatures generally to address discipline policies.
Thanks, Liz, and hi, everyone. So like Liz said, today I'm going to set the stage a little bit by providing you with a national perspective on these issues. I'm going to quickly go over a review of the data around exclusionary discipline, the research on alternative school discipline strategies, and some examples of recent state policies related to these issues. So just as a quick intro to Education Commission of the States, hey, Liz, I don't think I have control over the slides. Yeah. There we go. As a quick intro to ECS, ECS serves as really a hub of education policy information for state education leaders. We have a state level policy focus here at ECS, a little bit less on implementation, and the information you're about to see here is often presented to state legislators around the country in an effort to give them a quick overview of these issues. So to start off, what is the issue and why does it matter? So put simply, the issue is that disciplinary outcomes are showing some really stark disparities across the country. As you might know, the U.S. Office of Civil Rights just released data from the 2015-2016 school year a couple of months ago and found in that data that suspension and expulsion outcomes were very different based on race, gender, and disability status. So for example, while Black boys were represented 8% of total enrollment nationally, they accounted for 25% of students who received an out-of-school suspension. And while students with disabilities represented 12% of students enrolled, they accounted for 26% of students who received an out-of-school suspension. And there are also some disparities based on gender. Boys are typically suspended at much higher rates than girls, but Black girls were overrepresented in out-of-school suspensions in that school year, while girls of other races didn't disproportionately receive out-of-school suspensions. And just a quick note on the research here, the research suggests that students who are subjected to suspension or expulsion in school suffer academically, are more likely to be retained and drop out of school, are more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system later in life, and are less likely to contribute as productive members of the economy. So states are generally trying to limit the use of suspension and expulsion, but how are they suggesting that schools address student misbehavior? So generally speaking, they're exploring the use of alternative or more supportive school discipline strategies. Alternatives to suspension and expulsion really aim to keep students engaged in the classroom while addressing those root causes of student misbehavior, and could include the implementation of things like restorative and trauma-informed practices, positive behavioral interventions and supports, and social-emotional learning, just as a few examples. And while research on the effectiveness of these more supportive school discipline strategies is really still in the beginning stages, some recent studies do suggest that well-implemented programs decrease harmful student behavior, could improve school climate, and could reduce these disciplinary disparities we just went over. So what are states doing? Because of the research that I just went over showing the negative impacts of suspension and expulsion policies, the conversation around school discipline reform has really been focused on creating a safe school environment while reducing the adverse effects of these policies. So as you can see on this map, this is a map of proposed legislation in 2017 at the state level. State education leaders are generally approaching this problem by either reforming suspension and expulsion policies, encouraging the use of alternative or more supportive school discipline strategies, or doing both. And in 2017, at least 23 states proposed legislation related to one or both of these topics. So this slide provides just a bit more specific information on state policies that have been enacted related to alternative strategies across the country. So most states that have enacted policies like this related to alternative school discipline strategies require some level of educator training and professional development. And I've included recent legislation out of Utah here as an example, because this bill required educators and school resource officers to be trained in restorative justice and to use those strategies as a first resort when addressing negative student behavior. And several states, including California, have enacted policies to encourage the use of positive behavioral interventions and supports, restorative practices, and trauma-informed practices. And often states are encouraging schools and districts to use these strategies as a first resort prior to exclusionary action. And then lastly, many states like Maryland have opted to establish committees to study the potential effectiveness of these strategies within their own state's context. So I'm going to turn it back over to Liz, but I'm happy to take any questions on this material during the panel discussion, and my contact information is here in case you want any further information. And this is just a quick slide with some resources that might be helpful to you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. That context is especially helpful as we dive a little more deeply into what is happening specifically in one state, Minnesota. I'd like to now introduce Elizabeth Pufall-Jones, a lead researcher for this report, to talk about what it means when youth feel disconnected from their schools because of disciplinary policies that exclude them from the classroom. So let me just share. All right, Elizabeth, you should be good to go.
Great. Thank you, Liz. Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Pufall-Jones, and I'm the Senior Research Scientist at the Center for Promise. And today I have the honor of presenting our research report titled Discipline Disconnected: How Students Experience Exclusionary Discipline in Minnesota and the Promise of Non-Exclusionary Alternatives. All right. There we go. So as stated previously, among the 7 priorities Minnesota Alliance with Youth are targeting to increase graduation rates, they indicate that, quotes, replace exclusionary discipline policies and practices with more effective alternatives was the priority that they wanted to address with this research. Together, we noted that while the negative impact of exclusionary practices on youth educational outcomes is well documented, little is known about how the students experience school discipline. This report explores the exclusionary discipline experiences of a group of young people and some of the promising non-exclusionary practices that exist in Minnesota. We take a systems approach to all of our research, believing that youth are active agents embedded within a complex developmental ecology. From this perspective, the behavior of a young person both influences and is influenced by the settings in which they live. That is, the young person's ecology is at once creating and being created by the young person. This theoretical lens emphasizes the need to understand the reasons underlying a young person's behavior. We do not condone acting disruptively in the classroom. However, we do believe that disruption could be symptomatic of experiences across developmental settings that need to be addressed. Removing a student from class or the school building as a consequence for misconduct is a disciplinary approach known as exclusionary discipline. The term specifically refers to disciplinary actions such as suspension and expulsion as primary interventions for responding to misbehavior, but also includes detention and being sent to the office. Research indicates that suspending and expelling students does not help students improve behavior, address underlying causes of their behavior, or make schools safer. In fact, exclusionary discipline is associated with an array of negative outcomes for young people, including worse academic performance, lower levels of school engagement, a greater chance of leaving school before graduating, an increased likelihood of future involvement with the criminal justice system, and higher levels of school violence and antisocial behavior, among others. Moreover, national discipline data consistently shows that these punishments are disproportionately levied at students of color and students with disabilities. Minnesota's discipline data are similar to national trends. In the 2016-2017 school year, there were 46,311 documented disciplinary actions in Minnesota. Nearly half of those were for non-dangerous student behaviors. For example, attendance issues, using the computer when not told to. And the most common reason, 35% of all cases, was disruptive and disorderly behavior. Particular student subgroups experienced disproportionate numbers of these punishments. For example, students of color comprise 33% of the population, but 65% of disciplinary actions. Students with disabilities comprise 14% of the population, but 42% of disciplinary actions. We offer these statistics as context and caution that our research was not designed to explore these disparities, but rather was designed to explore how a group of young people in Minnesota experienced exclusionary discipline. Thus, we had two related goals for this study. First, we wanted to understand student experiences with exclusionary discipline, and second, recognizing that Minnesota has many schools shifting to more supportive systems of discipline, we wanted to better understand how school leaders were implementing those approaches. To explore the youth experiences of school discipline, we conducted group interviews with a total of 38 middle and high school students in 3 Minnesota communities. All participants had firsthand experience with exclusionary discipline. Participants were asked to speak about their experiences with school discipline, including, but not limited to, what led to the incident, who was involved in the resolution process, and their subsequent experiences in school. Transcripts from the group interviews were then systematically analyzed to identify key themes. Across all group interviews, young people explained how their experiences with discipline led them to disconnect from school. Specifically, interventions often did not address the root causes of their behavior, disrupted their learning, and had the effect of making them feel unvalued and unwelcome. Participants expressed a desire to engage in school and succeed, but found that their school's disciplinary practices inhibited their ability to do so. The first theme, root causes of behavior, must be explored and addressed. Young people's responses indicated that the reasons for their behavior are not often part of the disciplinary process. The young people expressed wanting to share their perspectives and explain their behavior, but felt that often they were not given the chance to do so. This left students feeling wrongfully penalized and ignored. The second finding exclusion interrupts their learning process. Youth explained that being taken out of the class makes it harder for them to succeed academically, as they are not given the opportunity to make academic progress while excluded. For these young people, exclusionary discipline impedes opportunities to learn, threatening their connection to their school and educational experience. Finally, students need to feel valued, welcomed, and connected. Young people discussed feeling undervalued at school, noting that racism and other forms of negative labeling from school personnel, such as being called a, quotes, bad kid, often drove the treatment that led to those feelings, sort of a self-perpetuating cycle. Feeling undervalued and unwelcomed was a major theme of the focus groups and led to young people's sense of disconnection from school. To understand how schools are implementing non-exclusionary practices, we spoke with Minnesota school administrators implementing these practices at their schools. They discussed the mindsets that orient their schools' approaches to discipline, the disciplinary practices they use, and how they implement them, and the challenge they face in implementation. When discussing what schools can do differently, the administrators emphasized 4 ideas. Coinciding with our youth finding regarding discipline contributing to disconnection from school, one of the foundational mindsets these administrators spoke about is that disciplinary intervention should always support and be driven by student learning. As a result, all the school leaders we spoke with considered the success of disciplinary interventions based on the students' connection to school and success in their learning. In tandem with our youth finding that the root causes of behavior need to be explored and addressed, these administrators indicated that they interpret student behavior as a communication of needs. Students can experience a great deal of adversity in their lives, both in and out of school, which impacts their behavior. Seeing behavior through this lens is pivotal in addressing some of the needs that young people bring to school. When students feel safe and trusted by staff, they can be open about what they are experiencing and where they need support. Positive relationships allow school staff to meet the individual needs of students and contribute to a climate of care and compassion throughout the whole school. Finally, sharing power in this context refers to a sharing of the responsibility for creating a solution. Implementing non-exclusionary practices often involves establishing shared responsibility and accountability between members of school community, especially students. This represents a major break from the traditional discipline approach, where adults dominate the discipline process. This research offers a number of implications for policy and practice. The full list of considerations for policy and practice can be found on page 20 of the report. While we offer 4 considerations here, in the report we have several more. We organized our considerations under 3 categories: general, those for school personnel and district leaders, and implications for state policymakers, realizing that this research can contribute uniquely to conversations in each of these groups. To conclude, this research adds to the literature on school discipline and should act as a conversation starter. Young people have the right to feel valued and connected with their school. Schools can support this feeling with the discipline policy and practices implemented in the school. These policies and practices should work to support a young person and their strengths, rather than presenting them with a barrier that contributes to a growing physical and mental disconnection from school.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for demonstrating the critical findings from this report. Ooh, sorry. What is happening? Discipline strategies, both exclusionary and non-exclusionary, ultimately all depend on implementation. The experience that young people have with their discipline systems differs depending on who is implementing the system in their school or community. To talk a little bit more about what that means, we've invited several speakers to share their experiences in a moderated panel discussion. We're thrilled to have Don Robinson, a recent Minnesota high school graduate who attended schools with exclusionary discipline policies as well as schools with more restorative practices. We've also invited an administrator from Minnesota, Cindy Everling, to discuss her experience with implementation of exclusionary and non-exclusionary practices. They are joined by Elizabeth from the Center and Alyssa Rafa from ECS. We'll have about 25 minutes for this panel discussion, and then we will open up to questions from the audience. And we are excited because we have webcams, so we're going to be setting them up quickly so you can all see their faces.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Monica Kinchlow, and I'm a Senior Director here at America's Promise Alliance working on GradNation, and I'm excited to moderate this panel discussion and dig in for some more perspectives on exclusionary discipline and the promise of alternative practices. Before we get started, I want to encourage all of our participants in the webinar who are viewing at home or from school or wherever you are to join in on the discussion on Twitter. We are using 2 hashtags today, and so long as the report is out. The first is hashtag GradNation, which you see at the bottom of your screen, and the other is hashtag exclusionary discipline. And our colleagues here at America's Promise will be tracking all of you online. So as you hear things that resonate, please tweet about it. So I want to welcome again Cindy and Don to the panel. We're thrilled to have field experience, frankly, as it relates to exclusionary discipline. And I want to give a special shout out to Don, who is a recently minted high school graduate, class of 2018. So congratulations, Don.
Thank you. Thanks. I appreciate it.
We're thrilled to have you here, and I appreciate your advocacy of restorative practices. So I'm going to go ahead and dive in. Cindy, I'd like to start with you. You have experience being a leader in a school that's implementing restorative practices. Can you tell us a little bit about what led your school to adopt non-exclusionary practices?
Yeah, so it was kind of a long road for us. It started about, sorry? Oh, I thought something. It started about 5 years ago when I began with the Minnesota Internship Center as a Promise Fellow through the Minnesota Alliance with Youth. I had just moved back to Minnesota and was looking for an experience outside of the classroom, getting to look kind of at the school as a larger system. I did some digging into our current discipline practices at that time, and saw that a lot of students were coming to us having experienced 2, 3, 4 different schools before that, and feeling very isolated from their school experience. There wasn't really a feeling of community and involvement, and a lot of that had to do with how they were treated when disciplined. And so I looked at what we were currently doing as a school, which was kind of the same thing as their other schools, and looked at restorative practices, which really grounds itself in community and in everybody's shared voice. And yeah, that's kind of where we started and began learning more and more about that.
Thanks, Cindy. So as we keep that in our minds, I want to turn to Don, who, as a young person in school, has experienced both exclusionary discipline and restorative practices. So I want to invite you to just share with the group, how would you compare the experience with those 2 different kinds of discipline, and how did each of them make you feel?
Well, when I was at Armstrong High School, that's like, a regular traditional school. I was dealing with a lot of things that normal teenagers are dealing with, like anxiety, stuff going on at home, all that. And it's just like resulted in like my grades slowly dropping. I was skipping school. I wasn't, going to school, and my mom kept on having to go to court for, my attendance. And I was always having lunch detention like all the time. And like it was just, a constant circle, like repeat, like I do this and I get in trouble, and like, like you were saying, Cindy, that, that kind of like label that is put in on, us. And it's not like it's really isolated from the regular school, and don't feel like you're in the community. And going to Paladin where, they were using restorative practices, it was like really different. And it was kind of like everybody was listening, I would say. It was just everybody, I got to meet everybody. I know all my teachers there. I know all the staff's names. And it like it showed me that people, what I mean, like teachers do care. It kind of had I had a different input on things, and it kind of like, made me feel empowered that like people do listen, that I have a voice, and it made me feel like I could take on the world. That's, like I was capable to do anything, that people were listening, and they were, telling me that like you have a lot of good stuff to say. And I never would have thought that, because I just thought, I was one of the regular like bad kids, as you would say. And it's not that. Like everybody has their individual skills, things that they're good at. And if you can empower them and like figure out why they're not coming to school, and figure out what's actually going on at home, or all that. Like I can say at Paladin every day I miss school, they knew where I was. My teacher was calling me. It's kind of that personal, relationship that was really, really amazing. Yes.
Thanks, Don. I think together, Don and Cindy's perspectives, sorry for the background noise, together, Don and Cindy's perspectives really help set the stage for the why on this, and how it makes individuals and schools operate and feel in the school setting. I want to turn to Elizabeth, given the research context here as well, and your findings that you shared in the report today. If you were to imagine a school administrator like Cindy or one of her colleagues in Minnesota or across the country is contemplating a shift in discipline policy, how could an administrator use this research to inform his or her decision?
Well, I think that this research really sheds light on the importance of having a conversation, not just with the young people in your school, but with the administrators, and trying to start thinking about what's working and what's not working. Like Cindy was saying, that she started looking at the school and what was working and what was not working within the school that she was working in. And so I think that this research really offers that perspective for everybody, and that they can look at this and think about how is the community in their school, how are young people experiencing the discipline? Is it actually creating a difference in their school so that they are seeing positive effects come out of whatever disciplinary practice they've chosen to implement? Or are they not seeing the impact that they would like to see from their discipline? And maybe they can start thinking about some of the alternatives that are discussed in the report that we offer, and some of the experiences that administrators that we spoke to offer. So I think it's really a conversation starter, sort of giving people topics that they can then pull off of to think about with their faculty, with their staff, and with the students at their school.
Great. It's always good to have actionable research. I'm mindful that a lot of our discussion right now is really focused at the school level or maybe the district level, but a lot of folks might believe that changes in discipline policy come about because of something that's happened in a state house or at the federal level. Alyssa, when you were talking about the state legislation earlier on alternative discipline policies, I wonder if you could share about sort of where the change is being mandated. Is it at the school, district, or state level?
Yeah, so that's a complicated question, and really the change is being mandated at all 3 levels for different types of things, I would say. So at the state level, so like I said, ECS is a state policy organization, so that's really where I look at policy, is just at the state level. And what they're saying at the state level is state action that they're requiring are things like task forces to study or study committees to look at what these practices might look like within the state and throughout each state. And then creating reports on the use of these practices. So taking data up from the school and district level and aggregating it and saying this is what it looks like in our state, right? So that's sort of what state action looks like. But then also at the state level, there's a lot of encouraging the use of these practices at the school and district level, or providing some funding for a pilot program. And I think, let's see, the other thing would be sort of requiring training for educators and other school personnel at the district or school level, and it's different in every state. I hope that helps.
That really helps, thank you. So knowing that so much can happen at the classroom level and school level, I want to turn to Dawn and sort of ask you, Dawn, to share why you think restorative practices are worth exploring and what you think teachers and administrators need to know about how exclusionary discipline impacts young people.
I would say it's worth exploring because the community building and like the relationships that are actually gained within, using that. Because I can say at the beginning of like my journey or our journey at Paladin, teachers, like, they had to mediate at first, like show the students like this is what restorative practices is, train some of the students, like just let them know how to use it and what are, the benefits about it. And then like the next year, it was like really, really cool. Like everybody kind of took the initiative upon themselves. Like it was kind of like we were naturally like mediating our own issues. We were naturally handling everything like we were actually like we took responsibility for our actions. And it was kind of ingrained into the school. And it was just a really, 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 it was so amazing. And for your next question, I would say that like for administrators and teachers to know that we're all human, you know what I mean? Like just that understanding on the behalf of students and administrators, it's that, leads to knowing that, on the students' behalf, that leads to knowing that not all, not teachers are not like superheroes, they're humans, you know what I mean, who are willing to teach us things, and they're amazing people, and we just need to have respect for them. And administrators, knowing that we're people just like you guys too, and we deserve, we're worth speaking to and hearing our voice, and the things we have to say actually matters, and not just kind of feeling like the older one, you know what I mean, and feeling like that it's right, because we're living in this world as just like everybody else. So we have a lot of good things to say, and just listening to both stories builds the community, and it's really, really strong when you have administrators' parts and you have students' parts. It's, you hear what's actually going on. And I would also say is there's also, only like a certain number of ways that a student, can react to a situation. So when a student is placed with constantly being disciplined in regular schools, like, when that's not working out, trying a new approach is really, really like, is a good thing to, try. And yeah, that's everything.
Thank you, Dawn. I think that perspective is really valuable. Elizabeth, do you want to jump in?
I did want to jump in. So I really appreciated what Dawn was just saying, and I think it highlights what we were trying to point at, or one of the themes that came across in the stories of the young people that we spoke to, which is that everybody is developing within this complex system, and there are multiple contexts that are involved in it. There are things that are taking place in people's lives, both students, teachers, administrators, that are happening in school and outside of school. And all of these things need to be considered. As Dawn was saying, we're not superhuman, you know, we come in and we have issues that we have to deal with as well. And so I think what Dawn's experience is highlighting, it's just highlighting that dynamic nature of development and having to consider that when you're considering any approach that you're going to be taking to discipline at your school, is that it's very complex, and we need to factor in all of those contexts and all of the different sides that are involved.
I just wanted to jump in really quickly. So what Dawn was saying about, you know, the first year it's a little weird and we're all kind of feeling it out, and then later it becomes more natural. That's bared out in the limited research so far on the use of these alternative strategies. And that's something that we try to communicate, and I would encourage everyone to try to communicate about policy at any level, is that a longer policy arc is helpful. So these sorts of things take time to implement, and they take time to take hold, and take time to even get buy-in in the first place. So just wanted to throw that out there.
I think that's a really important part of this whole equation, is giving these things time, because mindset shifts take time. And so to that, on that note, I want to close out with one last question to Cindy about advice you would have for teachers and administrators that are contemplating this type of shift in discipline policy. And then we'll move to a question and answer from our audience.
Yeah. So I think what Alyssa said, it takes time, is one of the biggest things, because change doesn't happen right away. It's incremental, especially changing a mindset, looking at discipline from an entirely new perspective, not one of consequences, but one of learning and teaching. It's different from what we're taught in the traditional sense. And I think people that are starting to explore alternatives to exclusionary policies definitely need to spend that time to get on the same page together, to build a shared vocabulary about what is it that they're trying to accomplish, what are their goals, and what is their vision. And so having that vision of students really learning to, sorry, I lost my train of thought, where students are able to learn from their behavior, learn to express themselves, and learn to regulate is a huge thing. So I think building that shared understanding, and also taking time to step back and address any questions. One of the big questions for my school was, well, what about accountability? If there isn't a consequence, what is there? Are we just letting kids off the hook? And the answer to that was no. We're teaching them to take accountability for themselves, to take responsibility, and to learn to regulate themselves, which is actually a lot more difficult than giving them a consequence. And then another thing was, it is really hard to engage in something that's different, and having that grace. And Dawn, you kind of spoke about that earlier. You know, we're not superhuman. We're all just people, you know, and there has to be grace and forgiveness in order for those things to move forward.
Thanks so much, Cindy. I appreciate everyone's perspectives on this panel, and I think your perspectives help to highlight how all of this is very interwoven. Policy, practice, and data are not separate when it comes to discipline policy. So thank you so much for your perspectives. I know we have a lot of questions coming in through our chat function, so I'm going to turn it over to Liz, who's going to pose some questions, and we're going to do our best to pose it to specific panelists.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say we're getting a lot of really great questions from the audience, and unfortunately we just don't have the time to answer all of them. So following the webinar, if we didn't answer your question, you're welcome to email us at gradnation90@americaspromise.org, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. And you can just ask us your question and we'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible. We're also hoping that the report itself can answer some of these questions as you dive more deeply into that, and we have a link to that following the presentation. So I think that each of you as panelists have provided really important context and sort of what it's like to try to implement changes, and also like what the change kind of looks like. But we're getting a lot of questions about implicit bias. So I'm going to kick this over to Elizabeth, I think, because she was the lead researcher. And the question is that it's interesting to see that efforts to address implicit bias on part of educators and systems as a whole is included. And the person asking the question just wants to know, in what ways has the research examined these efforts, and are there any findings?
Right. So our research did not look specifically at the role that implicit bias was playing. However, I would say that our research did show that there are a lot of built-in biases that are coming into play, as we talked about with the labeling of it, the labeling aspect, and how it was affecting the young people. And I think that in the current climate of the country, there is more research that will be going on and taking place, looking specifically at the role that bias plays in the disciplinary policies. And I have a feeling that Alyssa or somebody else probably also has information that how new policies are being implemented or affected or proposed to help address some of these biases that are involved. Yeah, I think it's a new area, especially given the disparities that we're seeing in all of the discipline data that is out there, and from what we heard from the young people.
I would just echo what Elizabeth did really quickly and say that that question is ahead of its time right now, in the sense that we're just now seeing some pretty solid research around how implicit bias affects school discipline and disparate outcomes. And so I think we're going to have to wait a little bit to see good, solid research on approaches to addressing implicit bias and the outcomes of those approaches.
That's super helpful. Thank you both. This is a question more for Cindy. I think the question could be applicable to all, the first part, but the second I really want to hear from Cindy. We have, if you could explain sort of, are sharing power and sharing responsibility through restorative practices the same thing, or is there a difference? And we're asking that in the frame of what is it like to incorporate student voice in the decisions you make about like using your restorative practices?
Could you rephrase that? I'm sorry.
Does she not? Did we mute it? Hello?
Did you hear that clarification?
I didn't.
Oh,
I'm so sorry.
We were muted. But we've had some time to kind of rephrase it in a way that makes a little more sense. Basically, we were just wondering When we use the phrase sharing responsibility, it means that both adults and students are responsible for making decisions about behavioral issues. So we were just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it's like to incorporate student voice and how, if you have an experience of what it was like to really listen to a student and addressing a behavioral problem.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. It can be very scary to share that power sometimes. I think, especially when you are raised in a very traditional setting, as I was as a youth myself, it was adults make decisions. Youth are quiet and listen. But one of the very powerful things is that I've learned through using restorative practices is that we all have a very valuable perspective on things. And together we can come up with solutions to issues that we would never have come up with isolated. So I'll share an example. One of my first years as an administrator, I worked with a youth, and one day I was out sick, and I got a call that she was in my office making IDs for students on our ID machine. The next day I came back, sat with her. She had experienced exclusionary policies in the past and assumed that she was going to get kicked out. We sat down together. I asked her, what happened? Why did you do that? And she wasn't really sure. She wasn't able to articulate that very well. But knowing what I know about brain development in teenagers, sometimes that's okay. But we talked about the whole situation, and I got to share how I felt in it, and she didn't, and she got to listen to how the whole thing played out for me. And I was able to listen and to her, and we both had that mutual understanding and mutual that relationship together. And so together we came up with ideas for how to repair that. And part of that was her getting to work a little bit closer with me to understand my perspective some more. And that included being a leader within Circle. We did daily circles. And in that time, she really grew into her leadership abilities and was able to thrive.
Thank you, Cindy. I think stories of success are always a motivating factor in this type of work. I actually want to invite Dawn to respond to this question as well. Dawn, I know when you were in school, were a Circle leader. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to your experience as being part of that shared responsibility and ownership over discipline actions.
Well, yeah, kind of like when I was first starting off, I mean, of course I didn't start off, as a leader right away, but it kind of it took that, that one, something to happen to kind of have that initiative. But I feel like it's if, a lot of that needs to that reaching out, you know what I mean? I feel like that's what it takes to kind of just uplift somebody to take that leadership role. You know what I mean? I think that's really important to do that, is incorporating, reaching out, not only to just one student, but, reaching out in all types of different ways that it can kind of grasp all these different types of students. And I think that's kind of, how it caught me too, is they reached out in a way that nobody ever reached out to me. And it was, of course, I'm going to try it because it was really, really different. And it was it was a really cool experience.
Thank you
Monica,
so much.
Can I jump in on that too?
Sure.
Just to add that the research that a lot of the research that we do at the center, beyond just this amazing report, focuses on the importance of building relationships and how important relationships are to the developmental process for young people. And reviewing many of the reports that we have out there online, you will find that stories like Don was just saying, where he says having somebody that took the time to reach out to me like that made all the difference. And so I think it just sort of highlights the importance of building those relationships and being able to have those honest conversations and in the developmental process.
Thank you so much for adding that context. I think each of you provided really valid, or not, well, they were valid, but great perspective on what it's like to have student voice as part of these alternatives. Unfortunately, we are out of time for the day, so I just really want to thank all of the panelists for joining us, and I'm about to remove them from the webcam. So I just really appreciate all of your attendance today. You can download the report at americaspromise.com, and you can still continue using the hashtag GradNation and exclusionary discipline. We have the report live. It went live today. So we really encourage you to check it out and dive a little deeper into the conversations that we had today. We are also expecting questions throughout the next few days, and we will try to get better answers to you further. We additionally have an email that you'll get tomorrow with a survey that we really would enjoy your participation in filling out to learn a little bit more about your experience with this webinar today. So thank you so much for participating, and we look forward to supporting your continued efforts to improve outcomes for students.
Bam.
Bam!
Did I do good?
Yes!
Did I miss anything?
Promise, yes.
They were all watching.